Good afternoon, everyone. This is Bassam Haddad. I am the host of the podcast Flow. This is one of our more exciting episodes because we are hosting the man himself, Omar Shakir, who is the Israel and Palestine director at Human Rights Watch. And our topic today is democracy for some, apartheid for others, the Human Rights Organization's consensus on Israel-Palestine. Omar, كيفك?
Tamam, great to see you, Bassam.
Good to see you, my friend. I am looking forward to our conversation. I know that we talked before. Was it in the West Bank?
I think it was. Yeah, I think we set
Yeah,
up
a few years
recording
ago.
there. That was
And
probably 4 years ago.
absolutely. And I am very happy to speak with you again. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. This is a very important topic which has radically changed compared to 20 years ago. I mean, addressing this topic was a lot more arduous for many, many reasons. And today, this is a topic that everyone is discussing, of course, inside Israel as well, but here in the United States, in Europe, in a far more straightforward and reasonable manner. And I think that having you here with us to address the recent reports, Human Rights Watch and other reports on the matter, is very important in light of what we have been witnessing recently on the ground. But first, allow me to read your bio or parts of it. It's a very long bio. You are very accomplished, and and I'm very proud of you and very happy that you are doing what you are doing. I remember the old days at Georgetown when I saw you, rise up the ranks as a master's student, and now you're basically who people want to hear from on really, really critical issues worldwide. Omar Shakir serves as the Israel and Palestine director at Human Rights Watch, where he investigates human rights abuses in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, and has authored several major reports, including a 2021 report comprehensively documenting how Israeli authorities are committing the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution against millions of Palestinians. As a result of his advocacy, the Israeli government deported Omar in November 2019. Prior to his current role, he was a Bertha Fellow at the Center for Constitutional Rights, where he focused on U.S. counterterrorism policies, including legal representation of Guantanamo detainees. As the 2013-2014 Arthur R. and Barbara D. Feinberg Fellow at Human Rights Watch, he investigated human rights violations in Egypt, including the Rab'a massacre, one of the largest killings of protesters in a single day. A former Fulbright scholar in Syria, Omar holds a JD from Stanford Law School, where he co-authored a report on the civilian consequences of U.S. drone strikes. You pissed off everybody, huh? You on U.S. drone strikes in Pakistan as a part of the International Human Rights and Conflict Resolution Clinic. And he is also an MA. He has an MA in Arab Studies from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and a BA in International Relations from Stanford. Wow. Okay, Omar, we just talked you up a lot, so you have to deliver. I have no doubt that you will. So, as we were chatting before, and as everyone is talking, there is a new atmosphere worldwide on the question of Israel-Palestine. It is no longer the taboo that it was. It's no longer the kind of topic that just bringing up that topic in certain circles at certain points in the past would be tantamount to like risking one's well-being or job or what have you. Of course, discrimination is still continuing, and we are going to talk about this here and there, but it is something that has entered the mainstream, and there are reasons for that. We would love for you to tell us a little bit, first of all, about the title of this conversation, which is the Human Rights Organization's consensus on the question of Israel-Palestine. Where did it come from? How did it come about? And what are the specific reports that have made a landmark in that regard?
Well, first of all, thank you again, Bassam, for having me. It's always a pleasure, and I really enjoyed listening to your, podcast, and I'm really honored to be on one of them. So, when we talk about the situation on the ground today, we're talking about a moment of, in many ways, unprecedented repression of Palestinians. But at the same time, we have this really unique moment where so many different organizations, individuals who come from very different backgrounds with very different experiences and mandates have such a similar, clear eyed assessment of the reality on the ground. I don't think we've had a moment, Bassam, like that in Israeli Palestinian history. And I think the heart of it has been this consensus that the Israeli authorities' treatment of Palestinians amounts to apartheid. Now, this is a concept. Now, let's start by being clear. Palestinians, including scholars, have been describing their lived reality as one of apartheid for decades, and not enough listened in the international community. But what we've seen in recent years is international and Israeli organizations increasingly independently look at the issues, do research, and reach their own conclusions. And we've had many different organizations reach a conclusion that what Israeli authorities are doing to Palestinians amounts to apartheid. And that's basically based on a clear eyed assessment that between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea today, you have two groups of people, roughly equal size. They live in the same area. One group is methodically privileged, the other group is systematically repressed solely because of who they are. And that's the simplest summation of the reality you have on the ground. And so these different reports have reached the same conclusion because it's the only conclusion you can reach when looking at that reality on the ground. So today you have not only a consensus among Palestinian civil society, you have major Israeli human rights groups, including the flagship group B'Tselem. But in late December, when the new Israeli government came to power, 27 Israeli human rights organizations use the term apartheid to describe Israel's treatment of Palestinians. You have Human Rights Watch, you have Amnesty International. Beyond that, you have other major global human rights organizations. You have the Human Rights Clinic at Harvard Law School. You have several prominent UN experts, including the experts on racism, housing, the occupied Palestinian territory. And by the way, Bassam, it's not just limited to human rights experts. You increasingly have other voices from civil society, including former director generals of Israel's foreign ministry, former current members of the Knesset. You have the former Secretary General of the United Nations, 5 former European foreign ministers. You have hundreds of European parliamentarians. And you have states, including South Africa and Namibia, but not just them. You have actually the entirety of the African bloc at the Human Rights Council, the Arab bloc, the OIC. You have the foreign ministers of France and Luxembourg. I could go on for another 5 minutes, but the point is this, and you had 120 Israeli law professors earlier in March who also called it apartheid. So we know what the reality is. Our challenge now, Bassam, is to translate that shift in paradigm into actual changes on the ground because the situation only continues to get worse.
I did it again. I now am not on mute. So can you tell us, Omar, some of the about some of the responses to the most recent reports that Human Rights Watch produced? Some of the details about these reports and what they included that produced sort of a change in kind potentially, and why it was in some circles. Why did it create an uproar in some circles? Of course, circles that were not happy with the results of the reports and some of the controversies around some of the responses and the back and forth. Before we get to other organizations.
Yeah, I mean, let me, Bassam, take a minute to explain how he reached this conclusion because it is the most stark assessment Human Rights Watch has ever reached on the conduct of Israeli authorities. We did it the way Human Rights Watch works in the 100 countries around the world we operate. So we first, Bassam, documented the facts. We looked at how Israel treats Palestinians. We did case studies in the West Bank, in Israel, in East Jerusalem, and Gaza, comparing the treatment of Israeli Jewish communities and Palestinian communities. But we also looked at over 3 decades of our research. We looked at statistics, trends. We put together a really comprehensive assessment that spanned years of our fieldwork. We also looked at the work of our partners. So, step one was we documented the facts. Step two was we applied the law. Under international law, there's a prohibition, there is a term for severe discriminatory oppression, and it's called apartheid. So, while the term was coined in relation to specific events in Southern Africa, treaties like the International Covenant on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and the ICC's Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court's founding treaty, define apartheid as a universal legal term. It's the term you use when you have a situation of really severe discrimination and oppression. And it's also a crime against humanity. What that means is that when you have really serious abuses that take place in a context of systematic oppression by one group of people over another, and when that's committed with the intent to maintain the regime of domination, that's apartheid. And when we applied that law to the facts that we documented, we reached the very clear conclusion that Israel's treatment of Palestinians amounts to apartheid. That's because we documented that the Israeli government has pursued a policy or an intent across Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory to maintain the domination by Jewish Israelis over Palestinians. That takes the form largely of control over demographics and land, maximizing land for Jewish Israelis while confining Palestinians into smaller and smaller enclaves. That policy is explicit in some areas. There's a formal policy to Judaize the Negev and the Galilee, for example, regions that make up 2/3 of Israel. The municipality of Jerusalem has a formal written government policy to maintain target demographic ratios between Jews and Palestinians. And there are policies that are clearly about demographics. And you combine that with systematic oppression, right? Dual legal systems that treat Palestinians and settlers differently in the West Bank. You combine that with mass land expropriation, sweeping movement restrictions, home demolitions. We could go on and on and on, but we reached the conclusion that that amounted clearly to the crime against humanity of apartheid and persecution. By the way, it's not the only place in the world we've reached this conclusion. We also found China's treatment of the Uyghurs to constitute crimes against humanity, Myanmar's treatment of the Rohingya to constitute apartheid and persecution. The reactions we got, Bassam, as you can imagine, were those of outrage. But what you'll notice, and I've briefed several dozen governments on this report, I've done, maybe 100 public talks, if not more. Nobody challenges the facts that we've documented or how we apply the law to the facts. Instead, what you see is an attempt to do ad hominem attacks, to attack the messenger, to make this not about our research, but to make it about, is Human Rights Watch biased? Is it anti-Semitic? And I think that's a reflection that they've lost on the merits. They don't even want to engage in the conversation because they know that even having the discussion is for them an acknowledgement that the rhetoric, that the kind of imaginary reality that we've been force fed in the United States of two equal parties that are in a peace process of an intractable conflict is just false. It's covering up a reality of one government committing apartheid. So instead, they try and attack the messenger, but they're failing because more and more are calling calling a spade, identifying reality for what it is.
Can you tell me a little bit about what other organizations have arrived at by way of recent reports that, frankly, also depart from the norm in the past 30 or 40 years? Besides Human Rights Watch, you mentioned B'Tselem. Can you tell me a little bit more specifics about B'Tselem and perhaps other organizations in Europe and the United States?
Absolutely. So, I mean, B'Tselem is Israel's flagship human rights organizations. They've been working for several decades documenting human rights abuses in the occupied Palestinian territory. In January of 2021, they released a position paper by which they declared it's no longer possible for them to only focus on the occupied Palestinian territory because it's become increasingly clear that there's a single regime, a single system of governance that operates between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. There isn't a situation of democratic Israel and abusive occupation. There's actually a single government that rules over all people. And the organizing principle by which that government operates is apartheid. And that was a quite powerful statement, given that it came from B'Tselem, a group that is based in Israel, that works in the occupied territory. That's a well-known, respected organization to reach that conclusion. Even before they did so, 6 months before, in July of 2020, the Israeli human rights group Yesh Din, authored by Michael Safard, a legal brief that concluded, focused on the West Bank, that concluded that the situation in the West Bank met the legal test for constituting apartheid. Since then, as I noted, there have been many other Israeli human rights groups, Gisha, Physicians for Human Rights, Israel, even more mainstream groups like the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, who has been analogized to the ACLU of Israel, or Peace Now, which was the flagship organization for the peace movement in Israel, have also used the term apartheid to describe Israel's treatment of Palestinians. Every major Israeli group, in effect, has done so. And even in the United States, Bassem, I mean, I mentioned the Harvard Law School Human Rights Clinic that reached that conclusion. There have been many, many other prominent organizations. The Center for Constitutional Rights, of course, has done so. We've seen as well legal scholars, Lawrence Tribe, at Harvard. We've seen commentators, Ali Velci from MSNBC, even John Oliver, even pop culture icons. I mean, we could go down the list. In people in the U.S. Congress, right? We saw in 2021 and since, not just Ilhan Omar and Rashid Tlaib, but we've seen AOC, we've seen Cori Bush, we've seen other members, even in the U.S. Congress, that have used this term. We've seen letters that have been written by hundreds of members of the Democratic Party. We've seen a survey and polling data of Middle East scholars in the U.S., of young Jewish Americans, of young Democrats. The most recent survey data, I believe, from, I can't remember, I think it was Gallup, showed that more Democrats sympathize with Palestinians than they do with Israelis for the first time in their history of polling data. So there are many different demarcators to indicate that indeed this different analysis that centers on the lived reality of everyday structural oppression and violence has become more and more the growing understanding of more folks.
I'm trying to be polite, and because I guess I heard myself breathing, so I muted myself. Can we? Is there a difference between human rights organizations reports on Israel Palestine in the last period, the last 5 to 7 years, as opposed to prior, between Europe and the United States?
I mean, absolutely. I think there is a shift, right? I mean, I think in Europe there has long been conversations of these issues. I've done briefings with the Norwegian Parliament, with the European Parliament. I've met with a number of European governments. Obviously, it's hard to speak of one Europe because the policies are so distinct when it comes to Israel Palestine. I mean, there is sort of deep fractures. You have some states. I mentioned France's foreign minister has, in an interview, in effect, said that the current reality is one of apartheid. He said that there's a risk of apartheid. Even the status quo produces that. The foreign minister of Luxembourg has cited B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch's apartheid reporting. We've seen other governments who have made reference or have said they're engaging seriously with the findings. But of course, you also have governments like Germany who have taken the opposite approach and rejected that the apartheid analysis is, fits the situation in Israel-Palestine. So while these divisions exist in general, maybe putting Germany to the side, there has been for some time, more open conversation. You have more mainstream political parties that will openly adopt resolutions, weigh these issues, grapple with it. So it's been much more a core part of the political debate, I would say, in much of Europe, with some exceptions. In the United States, there has been a serious shift in where civil society is. That's can be seen whether you're looking at college campuses, human rights organizations, progressive Jewish organizations. I mean, I didn't mention them earlier, but even groups like Americans for Peace Now or J Street, while they haven't themselves, although Americans for Peace Now has referenced apartheid, J Street hasn't taken a position on it, but at the same time, they're defending this kind of rhetoric. They're making references to it. They're calling on people to take this reporting seriously. These are groups that many cases self-identify as Zionists. So we're seeing that shift, but that has not yet shifted into the mainstream of the Democratic Party, where you still have a progressive wing that's willing to call reality by its name, but there remains to be resistance from the administration and even from the from the, I'd say, center of the Democratic Party. There's a disconnect between where the rank and file membership is and where the elected officials are that are especially in this central part of the Democratic Party. But I think there's a tension there, and that tension, will over time, I think, resolve itself, hopefully sooner rather than later, for the sake of all people living under Israel's apartheid.
Let me, before we move to the current situation, which is basically the recent developments earlier in the West Bank and more recently inside Israel and the protests in response to the right-wing government and so on. Before we get there, I would like to ask you something that might be a little bit, dicey, and that is, what happened in order for human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and others, who actually in the 1990s, when we would be complaining about the same exact things, or in the 1980s or the early 2000s, and there wasn't a huge difference between their position and some of the quote unquote progressive positions we hear in Israel about the occupation, about apartheid, and so on and so forth. I mean, there was of course a difference. There were critiques of violations. George Bush critiques the illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank. I mean, everybody can critique, but there's a fundamental structural injustice known as settler colonial policies that existed as long as those of us who were watching can remember or listening. So what happened for this change to take place and for this new discourse, these new reports to take place, in as though it's just a matter of fact, but it was a matter of fact many decades ago. Uh, is it the 2009 bombing of Gaza? Is it the
Yeah.
2014 Operation Cast Lead, where we began to see anchors on mainstream TV being just revolted or just appalled by the level of violence? Is it the on and off right wing lean in Israel? I mean, what changed? Why is
Yeah.
it that now we hear in the United States many groups who support Israel are starting maybe 10 years ago or a little before begin to critique seriously? I mean, and to be honest and fair and straightforward, the critique wasn't that we are violating the rights of a human being, millions of human beings. The critique was these policies are going to destroy Israel, and that's why they're critiquing them.
Yeah, I think it's a fair question, but Sam, and a good question. I would say there are at least four factors that are there, especially when you talk about where we are today from where we were. And so let me just mention them each briefly. I would say there is a structural, a methodological, a factual, and a legal that all came together in the span of recent years. So let me go through them in order. So let me start with the structural dynamic. Human Rights Watch in the 80s or 90s was largely a organization headquartered in New York, or maybe they had offices in London or Geneva, of people who would travel to a country, spend a few weeks, do a report, come back and write up the reports. Over the years, Human Rights Watch has made and other organizations have made quite a push to shift. So instead of that model, we're opening offices in different countries around the world. We're living in the communities that we work in. We come from the communities we work in, which means that we invariably better understand the lived experience of people living under oppression. So it's not that we're coming in for 2 weeks to look at a specific issue and going back to a different reality. There's just a different structure in place in how we operate, how we do our work, who does our work. And that's a reality that makes us, I think, much more closely connected to the lived experience of human rights victims. The second thing, Bassem, is methodological. And you know this as an academic and a researcher. Human Rights Watch, when we do research, our instinct for 30 years was, let's do very specific research. What does freedom of movement look like in Gaza? What does land access in this particular sliver of land in Israel look like? What about home demolitions in this part of the West Bank? Because that's how academics do research. We had a sense, and it probably dates back to the 50th anniversary of the occupation, which is 6 years ago, where we really evaluated our work. And we had a sense that maybe in the course of being so specific and talking about specific violations in certain areas, we were failing to kind of take into account and reflect the larger reality on the ground. So we asked a different research question in the apartheid report. We asked the question, how does Israel treat Palestinians? We never asked a question that broad before. We often were much, much more specific. So that different methodological question led to a body of research that pointed us in the direction of different parts of the law and led us to find apartheid and persecution, which are both system-based crimes. So you have to look more broadly. You don't have to. You could look narrowly, but it's much more compelling and clear cut when you reach that conclusion. So that's the methodological. I mentioned the structural. The other two, Bassam, I would argue, is legal and factual. Legally, yes, the crime. I mean, Human Rights Watch, our mandate is the law, right? So if something is not in human rights or humanitarian law, we don't write about it, right? So apartheid, as I noted, is a legal term, and it's been on the books since at least the 1970s when there was a convention on apartheid. However, there has been no case anywhere in the world until very, very recently, in the last year or two in South Africa, of any prosecutions of anybody for apartheid. So because the crime has never been prosecuted, people don't use it that much because there isn't much case law precedent to go out of. What changed? In 2015, the state of Palestine acceded to the Rome Statute, which meant that the International Criminal Court suddenly had jurisdiction over the crime of apartheid in Palestine. So even though this was previously, people looked at apartheid historically or comparatively or theoretically, suddenly a very real court somewhere in the world had the jurisdiction, potentially, that was still contested, to actually hear and bring charges of this crime. So it made it much more tangible for us to look at it. And the final piece of the puzzle is about the facts on the ground. You're right, Bassem, that the abuses I mentioned date back decades. However, one of the three elements you need to find apartheid is to prove that there is an intent that is there by the part of the perpetrator, by the Israeli government, to maintain the domination by Jewish Israelis over Palestinians. Now, it's true that that's been the long-standing Israeli policy that dates back decades, if not since the founding of Israel. But for a long time, the Israeli government hid behind the argument that this was temporary, there was a peace process, etc. And Human Rights Watch, we don't write legal briefs. We only reach conclusions, when the evidence is overwhelming. And in the last few years, Israel has, basically, made crystal clear its intent. It's the fig leaf has gone away. In 2018, it passed the Jewish nation state law, which enshrines as a constitutional value that key rights like the right of self-determination only belongs to the Jewish people, not to Palestinians. Netanyahu directly said, we intend to rule over the West Bank in perpetuity. We consider Palestinians to be our subjects. There was talk of formal annexation. I mean, when all this rhetoric happens, there is no longer any pretense. So you combined the shift in structure with the different methodological question, with the legal shift in 2015, with this taking away the fig leaf, and then it became the reality that any credible organization whose mandate is the law you can't avoid reaching apartheid conclusion.
Um, and and so we're here now. I mean, regardless of we got here, how exactly we got here, because different organizations, different countries, have arrived at a very similar conclusion. And to be fair and factual, most countries had already arrived at this. There were just a few, and of course, we are seeing a move in the other direction by some Arab countries themselves for geostrategic and economic and security reasons, including in the Arab Gulf. So we are seeing that movement that might subside a bit as a result of geopolitical changes at the global level, as we have seen of late. But we see Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar, which was the pioneer, basically toying and flirting with the basically their policy of naturalizing their connection with Israel without a formal agreement. But we have seen Morocco, we've seen Sudan. There's been some movement, curiously, among Arab dictatorships in that direction. Uh, but when you were talking earlier about the 2019 law and how it developed, and I remember that maybe a little before you yourself were, as you shared earlier, and as I read in your bio, of course, you were deported. Can you just very briefly tell us why this happened? We don't have to stay long on this, but because this is a personal story that connects with everything else we're talking about, why were you treated that way a few years back? And I think that was the occasion of our conversation at some point.
Yeah, I'll give you the Cliff Notes version and suggest people go back to that podcast. Maybe it can be in the notes somewhere for those that want a longer readout.
Sure.
But Nassam, the short readout of it is that the Israeli government has been muzzling human rights advocacy for some time, and Human Rights Watch became enrolled in that. In 2016, we applied for a work permit. Human Rights Watch did, so they could hire a foreign employee. The Israeli government denied that request, claiming that Human Rights Watch is not a legitimate human rights group. We're propagandists for the Palestinians. We quickly went public. They were under a lot of pressure. They backtracked, and eventually the organization got a work permit, and I got a work visa. I entered the country. But pretty soon thereafter, Israeli right wing NGOs brought a lawsuit against the government, alleging that my entry violated Israel's newly passed law that prohibits entering in people who support boycotts of Israel. And that led the Israeli government to do its own review. And in May of 2018, they ordered me deported on the ground. So the argument shifted. They said that it's based on my advocacy supporting boycotts of Israel. Of course, Human Rights Watch actually takes no position for or against boycotts of any country, including boycotts of Israel. We document human rights abuse and we call on companies to end complicity in human rights abuse. Nevertheless, they made this decision. We sued to challenge the law and the decision. It went all the way up to the High Court of Justice. The High Court of Justice ruled against us. They upheld the deportation. They gave me 20 days to leave the country. It was very clear in the government's logic that this was about, and in the court's logic, that this was an assessment that Human Rights Watch's work, calling on businesses not to do business inter with settlements, because doing so makes one invariably complicit in the grave human rights abuses that exist in the West Bank, right? Including operating on land stolen from Palestinians, partaking in a dual legal system, hiring employees that have different rights depending on where they are, using infrastructure that's denied to Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Demolitions that take place to facilitate this entire system. That was the reason for the decision. So I was given 20 days to leave the country, and I left on that basis. But of course, I've continued in this role. Human Rights Watch has kept doing the same work. Israel is not the first country that's barred the organization access. Other countries have done so. Egypt, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, among them. And we continue to work on those countries in the
Nice
same way
group.
that I do. Nice group. Yeah. I mean, that's a group that Israel has firmly become a part of.
Um, Okay, let me turn to what everyone's focusing on right now, which is what's going on in Israel-Palestine, whether it is the increased violence emboldened by the emergence of an unprecedented right-wing government in Israel, all the way to the protests against the potential legal reforms and judicial reforms and or reforms regarding various laws inside Israel. And of course, this is a very interesting topic, right? Because a lot of people are here in the United States, for instance, incensed as though this is the problem in Israel, right? Take away that government, and things are, not perfect. Maybe some a reasonable person would say, but they're okay. But of course, the structure of repression, the structure of the occupation, of settler colonialism, of apartheid, I mean, is there. It's kind of like the same thing when people say the attacks of Gaza are in response to the rockets. Let's assume everybody in Gaza became, I don't know if you can say these things anymore. It's 2023. Like, Mother Teresa, like every single human being became Mother Teresa in Gaza. Will the occupation end? Will these settler colonial policies end? Will the settlements be dismantled? And so on and so forth. Of course, everything will continue. So the only thing people are asking for from that particular side or vantage point is for people just to submit and stop resisting in any way, shape, or form, regardless of the nature of the resistance, regardless of various points of view about its feasibility, its human rights content. This is a structural issue that goes beyond, examples of the short. The point is that today we have a very interesting situation that is beginning to point to some of the deeper issues that animate this situation in Israel-Palestine. So how do we read that? Please feel free to address the increasing violence in the West Bank as well as the protest in Israel in any order you'd like, so long as we just connect them a bit to our conversation regarding a question of human rights.
Yeah, I mean, let's start with the Israeli protests. I mean, look, as somebody who works on human rights, it's always encouraging to see let's say not millions, let's say thousands or tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people take to the street to push back against government policy and to demand, protection of rights. I mean, that's something in general that's encouraging, right? But I think part of what's been frustrating about this particular situation is the framing of the narrative. This idea that you're, saving democracy. I mean, look, you have millions of Palestinians who have for decades been denied their basic civil or political rights from the government that primarily rules over their life. I mean, the reality is Israel, for generations of Palestinians, has denied Palestinians of their right to basic free assembly, expression, association. They have no say over that government that controls the most basic aspects of their everyday life, including freedom of movement, including access to resources, including issuing ID cards, the most basic sort of phenomena. And so to talk about a democracy, I mean, as Hagai Al-Ad, the executive director of B'Tselem, has written, democracy is the rule of the people, not the rule of one people over another. And so the framing of the narrative has been deeply, deeply, problematic because in essence, and again, we shouldn't speak about protests like they're one current. History, and Bassam, you know this better than anybody, shows us that demonstrations can begin as one thing and can morph into something else. It can also show us that one demonstration can bring together, numerous things. But what we've seen over months now of Israeli protests, the uniting behind the Israeli flag and the coordination of messaging, is that the problem has really been about the judicial changes and been about Prime Minister Netanyahu, as if reversing the clock 4 months ago would be just fine, that they would be okay. But if we reverse the clock 4 months ago, we still have millions of Palestinians living under apartheid. We still have daily structural violence and repression. So that creates this sort of paradox. Now, let's also acknowledge, Bassam, that there have been moments And there have been parts of the protests that have been making these connections, right? So, for example, when there was the settler rampage in Hawara, the Palestinian town in the West Bank, there were some protesters saying, "Where were you in Hawara?" talking to the Israeli security forces. There have been some protests. I've seen videos of them talking about democracy for all between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. But that's not been the majority current. So at the same time that we're seeing these Israeli protests, there's a split screen happening in the occupied Palestinian territory where in 2022, we saw more Palestinians killed in the West Bank than in any other year since the UN began systematically reporting fatalities in 2005. As of April 1st, there are more than 1,000 Palestinians held in administrative detention without trial or charge. That's a 2-decade high. There have been unprecedented moves against Palestinian human rights organizations. Now, none of these events, unfortunately, triggered mass demonstrations to take place in the streets of Tel Aviv. So, that speaks to, I think, the underlying reality. So, there have been people that have been saying that, maybe this is a struggle for Jewish democracy, but it's certainly not a struggle for democracy. Or maybe it's a, struggle of democracy for some, but it's not yet been one that's fundamentally, facially challenging apartheid. I mean, just here in New York, recently, Peter Beinart spoke at Washington Square Park at a demonstration in solidarity with the Israeli protests, where he made precisely the point that this was about democracy for Jews and apartheid for Palestinians. And he received what he described as a very mixed reaction. So, look, these things can change, they can evolve. But as we currently see it, we see these protests not as something that's fundamentally challenging the reality that is presenting a different vision for how Palestinians would be treated, but rather one that would change the mechanics of how certain systems work for Jewish Israelis. Let's remember, Bassam, Israeli apartheid has been rubber stamped by Israel's Supreme Court. It has signed off on settlements, on use of force standards that permits permissively killing Palestinians, on home demolitions. You can go down the list of policies, and the Supreme Court's imprimatur is all over them. Yes, there have been cases here and there where they've pushed back, including very recently a case of a land dispute in East Jerusalem where they pushed back against the Israeli government policies. But for the most part, it has been provided a veneer of legality over a system of apartheid and oppression.
And where do you think this might lead? I mean, we saw Netanyahu postpone, not cancel plans that were the cause of the protest for the most part. Do you think this is being addressed? Is it being addressed as a political issue that a particular government has to deal with protesters with demands, or is it running a little deeper than that? Something to the core where people might be addressing the potential ramifications of a serious split that would have consequences for the entire project altogether. Because we've heard, I've heard personally in the documentaries we did in the past 20 years, people say that Israelis saying Israel is in a precarious position, and people don't know if how long this project will continue, given everything that's given, even though they support it. So, do you think the response by Netanyahu, or what's likely to come next, is going to go be a bit lower than just politicking, or is it just politics and as usual?
I think I like to be an optimist, but I really think that we don't see a sign yet that there's any sort of deeper sort of reevaluation of things, right? I mean, the Israeli government clearly understands the threats that these protests bring. I mean, you've seen people refusing to serve in the army, diplomats refusing to continue in their posts. You've seen people talk openly about boycotting this government. So that's something that's, I think, the Israeli government sees as potentially very dangerous. So I think there is an effort to try and find, a compromise, but that would be a compromise that would, be focused narrowly on the issues of the judiciary that have primarily brought people, to the street. I think the Israeli, government does not want to be in a situation where it's having to deal with these larger questions, which anyway, Bassam, are matters of consensus. Unfortunately, in the mainstream Israeli political discourse today, the divide is about the personality of Benjamin Netanyahu, right? And maybe some of the people that he's brought to his government, like Itamar Ben-Gvir or others. But people before that who were considered the extreme voices of 3-4 years ago, Avigdor Lieberman, Naftali Bennett. These are people that are now seen as part of the moderate center or part of the opposition to Netanyahu. And so, if Netanyahu were ever to leave the scene, because a lot of what animates these protests are this issue of the charges against Netanyahu, the corruption allegations. If you remove the personality of Netanyahu, if you made this about about the project of dominating Palestinians, you would have an overwhelming consensus in the consensus. I mean, out of 120 current Knesset members, if you asked me how many would even use the word occupied to describe the West Bank, forget even Gaza, I'm afraid the answer would be that there would be less than 20 that would even be willing to use the term occupied to describe the West Bank. So there is a widespread consensus. So there needs to be a moment of soul searching, of reckoning, of dealing with the reality of committing crimes against humanity, of a system methodically engineered to privilege one people at the expense of another. There are brave voices in Israeli civil society calling for exactly that. And some of them are showing up to the protests. Some of them are our friends in Israeli civil society and the human rights community, but they're not the voices that are leading this protest movement. And they're not the voices that represent the opposition to Netanyahu in the Israeli Knesset.
Thank you. I mean, thanks for this. Actually, I'm glad you addressed that. Although I was like looking to this idea that if a compromise is struck, it's not like I wasn't looking at whether this will lead to some serious soul searching and structural reevaluation of everything in Israel for Israelis, but more about whether a compromise would be driven by an intent to prevent the breakdown of national unity
I
because
see.
of the Israel project, or whether it's just going to be politics as usual with no regard. I mean, to the
I see.
consequences,
Yeah,
because there's so much confidence right now where it's just politics as usual.
I think it's a great question, Bassam, and I think it remains to be seen. I think there are voices trying to reach a compromise for exactly that reason. And it's not a coincidence that this agreement to postpone by the government to postpone pushing forward the judicial bills was in part, came at the expense of giving Ben Gvir, for those listeners who don't know, right, the member of the Jewish Power Party who's been convicted even in Israel of terrorism and incitement, among other things, that he was given the approval to create a national guard. And he's been very clear that its mission would be to go after Palestinians. And that was the price paid for the government agreeing to delay this judicial overhaul, which I think is indicative that the Palestinian question is what's going to come, that they might compromise on the judicial stuff, but it'll come at the expense of Palestinians. So I think it's possible that there's a compromise that's reached on the judicial issue that allows the project to maintain power, but it's also possible that this opening, because there is a narrow opening, let's not be too, we can't deny that there is some opening that exists with these protests. Now, could that opening lead to something much larger? I think there are many that want to prevent that, but sometimes history has a way of leading things a certain way. So I think it remains to be seen.
And on the Palestinian side, what explains very, like straightforwardly? I mean, we probably, can recognize the answers, but what explains this? The record, the record of killing Palestinians. Is it just the right wing nature of the government, or is it also internal frustration in Palestine, within Palestinian territories, with another decade, another failure of change of actual conditions of life, the complete absence of any representation. Uh, I mean, it's no longer worth critiquing the PA anymore, as I see it, right? It's no longer like an entity really. It became obvious why from the very beginning it probably emerged to serve not Palestinians, but basically to paper over all sorts of problems in Israel-Palestine with the pretense of a state, or not even state, with the pretense of limited autonomy, or whatever they called the PA. The point is, is it a response to is the record of Palestinian killings, for instance, and the question of prisoners a response to that shift to the right, or is there something deeper happening as a result of the passage of time also?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a marriage of two things: one on the Palestinian side, one on the Israeli side. On the Palestinian side, I think you nailed it right on, right? Which is that there is no political horizon for Palestinians. There is nothing. I mean, the Palestinian Authority is inept. It's corrupt. It is, it has no real sovereignty. It does nothing other than, somehow it has no sovereignty, but yet is a police state. It has offered nothing for the Palestinian people. The Hamas authorities in Gaza, same thing, thuggish, authoritarian rule. So there is no political horizon. So what drove in 2018, 2019, Palestinians in Gaza to march at the fences with Israel is the same thing that's drawing many Palestinians now to join, groups like the Lion's Den, which is the one of the resistance groups emerging in small part in Nablus and other cities in the West Bank. It's the sense of there is no political horizon, that there's no answer to apartheid and PA complicity in that system, and so people are sort of acting out this way. So you combine that, right, with the reality that Israel has long, disregarded Palestinian life and has long used excessive force and has long authorized the use of force in situations that don't meet basic international human rights standards. So when you have an uptick in the Palestinians not just organizing kind of resistance in different areas, but to carrying out acts, violent acts, and you combine that with a government that disregards Palestinian life, that's intensifying its military operations and continuing to carry out, raids and use force in situations that are not lawful, firing into crowds, very aggressive arrest operations. You're going to see the kind of increase we've seen already in 2023. That the rate of killings has even outpassed the record level of 2022. So it's you feel like you're in a reality of almost daily. I mean, Ramadan it's been a bit less, but almost daily killings of Palestinians at a rate that is deeply, deeply alarming.
Thanks, Omar. Let's move in the next few minutes to the last realm, which is the question of anti-Semitism, academic freedom, and what's happening in the United States, which is, not surprising. But just today, and I cannot divulge, but just today, a former student of ours here at George Mason University, there was a conclusion of a matter in one of the U.S. universities, which is precisely about the question of the definition of anti-Semitism, and how critique of Israel or the Israeli policies, has become tantamount to anti-Semitism, which is, I mean, it's unbelievable. I mean, from any perspective whatsoever. But what happened? How did we get here? We've been here actually, but are we also? But we're seeing things that we haven't seen during the days where the critique of Israel in general was that much more risky. Is it a sign of the changing balance of, I don't want to say power, but balance of justice, or is it how public opinion is beginning to shift and be more aware of what's happening in Palestine? But we see a very vicious attempt to silence people who want to critique Israel. We critique every single Arab country day and night, at the risk of, sometimes at a physical risk if you're traveling over there and so on. But a few words about what is something that has a global consensus behind it, from even human rights organizations and so on, has become potentially a sin. And of course, people want to. I mean, there is of course a potential legal consequence to the critiquing Israel. Can you just shed light on this, on the question of the
Yeah.
definition of the anti-Semitism and the questions of academic freedom, given also that you were part of academia here in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think Bassam, I mean, I think very much what's happening now, and it links to what we said earlier, is the Israeli government and its supporters don't want to even engage, can't win the argument on the merits. They don't even want to engage in the debate. They know they can't win that debate on the merits, right? So what they're trying to do instead is shut down the debate and delegitimize the people who are engaging in that debate. So there's a very methodical effort to attack human rights organizations, academics, all these journalists, other people who engage in the work of truth telling, and they do it very methodically. And so I think it reflects that different effort. So, an anti-Semitism in particular has been, given the history of pernicious anti-Semitism and what it's done in the world, it's become the because no one wants to be labeled an anti-Semite. It can be for for younger academics, especially if you're a person of color, if you're Palestinian, it can be a career killer. It can block you from ever getting hired, ever getting tenure, ever getting far along. It can prevent you from getting jobs. And so what the Israeli government has done, and it's quite clear, is they've used, for example, a certain definition of anti Semitism. It's known as the IHRA definition of anti Semitism. Now, this definition of anti Semitism includes 11 examples of what constitutes anti Semitism, and they include things like denying Jewish people their right to self determination, e.g., by claiming that the existence of Israel is a racist endeavor. And that's the kind of language that could be applied to calling the situation apartheid. It could be used even if you say that Israel shouldn't be shouldn't be a Jewish state. It should be a state of all its citizens who live there, which is a rather basic, kind of claim. There's another example of anti-Semitism that's applying quote double standards by requiring of Israel behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation, right? But why do we hold Israel to the standard of a democracy, right? We might use other standards, human rights law, humanitarian law, that might be different. Does that make somebody anti-Semitic? But what I also want to, but today, what we've seen, and just now we've seen 60 different organizations from Israeli groups like B'Tselem and Gisha to the ACLU to Human Rights Watch push back on the IHRA definition. We've seen more and more examples of universities refusing to cite to use that example. The American Bar Association in January had a reference to the IHRA in a draft resolution on anti-Semitism. They removed it after pushback from a number of civil society groups. And Bassam, even to the example of academic freedom. I mean, many of your listeners might be aware of the Harvard Kennedy School in January having rescinded a human rights fellowship to the former executive director of Human Rights Watch, Ken Roth. Or some listeners might be aware that Jim Cavallaro, who used to be the president of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, he's a Harvard and Stanford law academic, was rescinded an appointment by the Biden administration to serve again on the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. These are very high-profile examples of individuals. But as you know, Bassam, because you've been in academia for a while, Palestinian scholars, Arab scholars, people of color have been facing these kind of things quietly under the table for years, if not for decades. And many have lost jobs, they've lost tenure. Stephen Salaita is a client that I used to represent, who was, had a tenured faculty position that he was fired from for tweets about Gaza in 2014. But what I will say on an optimistic note, Bassam, because this is definitely a trend, it's definitely worrying, is more and more we're seeing this called out and we're seeing people reverse course. So Ken Roth was reoffered the fellowship at Harvard Kennedy School. Valentina Azarov, who faced a similar thing at the University of Toronto, an Israeli critical scholar, is criticized occupation and other abuses, was revoked a job and then reoffered a job. Stephen Slaida's case settled. We've seen other examples. Even the Jim Cavallaro case I mentioned, it was widely covered as an example of the US's double standards. So I think more and more people are understanding this for what it is. As I said, the IHRA is on retreat. So yes, we are seeing an uptick in challenges to academic freedom. It's because the supporters of Israel know they can't win the debate on the merits, so they want to get unprincipled institutions who are influenced by donor funding or political pressure to cave. It
Or fear,
happens sometimes,
or
or fear.
like in the case that I was addressing. Well, actually, it's at Chapel Hill, who, in addition to your examples, also withdrew the IHRA resolution because of pressure from all sorts of groups. But the fear of administrators and various officials at universities, they're actually internally not convinced, but sometimes the fear of reprisal causes them to go along. And of course,
100%.
that's been the case for decades. But it's becoming less and less so here and there. And I think this is what you're referring to.
Yeah, and Bassam, let me just say, I mean, I've spoken in the last 6 months at probably several dozen U.S. campuses, Harvard, Yale, you name it, University of Chicago, and I've seen
You're
huge
naming all
audience.
the elite universities. Can you drop some
I've been at
second? No, I'm
many others.
joking.
I'm not going to identify any school as second rate, so I will not take your bait. But what I will say is that I've had huge, large audiences, engaged students, serious discussions, and there haven't been attempts really to try and get serious attempts that have succeeded to get the universities to cancel my talks because people, pro-Israel organizations know that these universities won't cancel Human Rights Watch speaking about its academic research, right? So instead, we've seen a trend of some of these organizations go to the corporate sponsors that maybe provide funding for food at the event or something like that. And they've gotten some traction in getting those law firms to distance themselves. But it reflects again a shift, Bassam. They're not only not debating on the merits, they're not only no longer trying to shut down campuses because they're not succeeding. They're trying to go now to the levers of political and economic power in hopes that that can, shut the door. They can close Pandora's box, but they're losing that debate. And the challenge of you, of me, of all of us that care about human rights and social justice, not just in Palestine, but in throughout the world that we work in, is to keep doing that work in a principled, determined manner. In a matter of time, I believe things will only continue to shift. And hopefully that shift can change things on the ground, which continue to be as desperate as can be.
Thanks, Omar. This has been extremely enlightening and extremely powerful. And I really hope as many people as possible listen. Even if they are detractors, just listen. Argue with the points, which is what you've been saying all along. Argue with the merits of these points. Point out alternative examples, realities, structures, legacies, histories. I hope that this will happen because that's frankly all one can ask for. And I hope that you and I continue to be in touch and perhaps we can talk later under better circumstances. I say this at every conversation I have about Middle East politics since the 1990s, and it kind of doesn't work very well. But let's hope that it does this time. Shukran, Omar.
Anytime,
Thank you so much.
anytime for you.
And
Take care.
happy anniversary. Last week was the anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. I know that this is something that you're concerned about. So,
Thank you.
طيب, thank you again for joining. And thank you for your really formidable knowledge of the various terrains: academic, legal, organizational, and then empirical on the ground. Thank you so much, Omar. Take care. Yeah, yeah. I'm trying to get the logo to come on.